Hello everyone, welcome to our SQL Azure Databases webinar. This is your host Kuldeep Singh and I'll be the presenter today talking about Microsoft SQL Azure Databases. So let's get started with the webinar in here. We're about to discuss what Azure SQL databases are, so let's quickly have the agenda down there. Today, we would be discussing up on SQL Azure databases overview. How do we start working, creating an Azure SQL server on top of databases, deployment and managing those databases. At the same point of time, different type of topologies, how can we do that in the deployment model? We'll be starting up with some of the top level concept followed by a couple of hands-on demonstrations in this session. And this is a 45 minutes time-bound session which we would be talking about. Then we'll be having our questions and answers starting up with all those concepts what we are discussing in the session here. So let's get started. Quickly talking about what is our Azure SQL database. Well, most of us are aware about that every business application out there requires the data to be stored somewhere. Now, it could be your traditional file system or could be your databases, your relational databases, your NoSQL databases, your big data sources down there. So as far as my relational data is concerned, we used to store it in our on-prem SQL Server databases. Now, with the evolution of Microsoft Azure Cloud, Microsoft Azure offers you a platform as a service solution in form of SQL Azure, where you can provision your databases with high performance requirements, your hyper-converged infrastructures, or whether you talk about a cost-efficient manner down there, we would be discussing plenty of them. So it is a platform as a service component, which is a database engine offered by native Azure services that handles most of the database management functions in case of your upgrading, migrating data from on-prem to SQL Azure, patching, backups, monitoring without any user involvement. So it's completely a managed service offering by Microsoft Azure. With your SQL Azure database, you can create highly available and high performance data storage layer for the application and solutions directly hosted in Azure. And you can talk about starting from the very beginning up to the advanced level of database deployment within the application specification needs. When we talk about the SQL Azure top level concepts, what are the major concepts available on SQL Azure? Let's discuss them one by one. Important thing, it is a fully managed platform as a service offered by Microsoft, meaning those were the days when you should be having a database administrator who's taking care of regular backups, maintenance plans, making sure everything's fine, monitoring some sort of upgrades, installation of the new servers, provisioning the SQL Server databases, high availabilities down there. So that's completely managed by Microsoft Azure now with SQL Azure. At the same time, it gives you plenty of flexibility in terms of performance, in terms of cost, in terms of functionality, in terms of availability to choose from. Various options are out there and we would be discussing a couple of them during this webinar. We talk about the hyperscale storage. So there were times when you talk about the HPCs, the high performance computes, and we talk about the isolated millions of IOPS required by our database to process the incoming peak traffic. And with SQL Azure hyperconverged storage functionality, we can pretty much achieve that, currently hosting up to 100 terabyte of database and expanding every day at Microsoft Data Center. At the same time, it offers you great service level agreement and availability up to 99.999% when you talk about any of your cloud hosted options when it comes to your relational databases. Autoscaling is a great functionality to have whenever you have some business requirements, the business applications, the load of the peak hours, or you got a season where you'll be getting high spikes on your web applications and you want the data layer, the RDBMS data storage layer to autoscale itself based on the heavy demand and downscale itself to save cost when the demand's not very high. We can configure those autoscalings quite easily on our SQL Azure databases. We talk about advanced data security, so you can have authentication authorizations plugged in all together. And with Microsoft Azure top-notch security parameters, we can ensure the data is visible to the people it's supposed to be, whether it's at the management layer, management plane, or the data plane, or the access layers, or the APIs down there. At the same time, you can offer intelligent pricing in terms of there would be situations when you have a performance-centric database deployment. There would be a situation when availability is the major concern. There would be time when budgeting and cost-efficient operations needs to be deployed. So we got the pricing for every possible scenario here at Azure. At the same time, let's understand the two major deployment models what are available with our SQL Azure database options. So the first one is deploying it as a single database. Doesn't matter whether it is my OLAP, online analytical processing database for business intelligence, or it is an OLTP, online transactional processing database for regular RDBMS operations. You can deploy that as a single database with the isolated compute in memory dedicated to that. We will be doing that practically in here. The second deployment model is your elastic pools, which can be great option in terms of logically grouping those databases underneath them more often to reduce the costing and have them in the pooled logical group container, and pretty much offering the same functionality at the reduced cost because the resources would be shared among them. And we will discuss both the deployment scenarios there on SQL Azure today. So let's start working on a quick demonstration here, which consists of a couple of exercises which we would be discussing. One, how do we create a SQL database server using Azure Portal? So let me quickly take you to my demonstration instance and we'll work up with all these 4 examples working up on Microsoft Azure. So let me bring up my browser in here. I am currently logged into azure.com, just in case if you guys are beginners on Microsoft Azure Cloud. Portal.azure.com is the site you need to be logged in, and once you log in with your associated user ID password, make sure you are a member of an active subscription which gives you access to provision these Azure resources. In my case, I've got plenty of subscriptions created in here, and I can use any one of them to deploy my Azure resources, whether it's my media resources, compute, databases, big data, streamings, analysis, plenty of things down the line in here. So let's start working when we talk about creating a SQL Azure database server. So when I talk about when you will be searching up with SQL down there, you will be getting multiple options. I'm getting SQL databases, SQL Server, Elastic Pools, managed instances, SQL virtual machines, Azure Cosmos DB is pretty much with the core a different component altogether. But when we talk about we're getting multiple things, I'll try to put up some of the glimpse in each one of those concepts down there. At present, we are talking about SQL servers. Now, we can always create SQL servers in here, and let me show you how do we do that, and then we will be discussing how this one is different from an on-prem SQL server deployment. So let me click on Add over here. That will take me to the SQL Server creation wizard, creation blade on SQL Azure. I need to select my subscription in which I will be creating that. So let me select this A04, the one which I'll be using for today's demonstration. I would indeed be creating a new resource group. So let's call it, that's going to be my Azure Weekends for SQL Azure. This is the name what I would like to make for this resource group. Let me click OK. This is going to be my resource group here. The name of the SQL server, what you would like to make it, it has to be unique, not on your resource group or your subscription, but entirely in the global directory. So consider that as a domain name service, kind of a DNS. So that name has to be unique. Let me just name it GTL DBSVR 97. This is the one I would like to make it. So the GTL DBSVR dot database.windows.net is always going to be the suffix when you will be interacting that with third-party services. Just like if you're talking about storage, you have core.windows.net as the suffix. If you talk about app services, you've got Azure websites.net as the suffix. Similarly, for your SQL servers, database.windows.net. Important thing is the location where I'm going to deploy that. So I'm choosing the nearest location in here. Let it be East US down there. And then what is going to be my SQL Server login? So let's talk about, I'm specifying a username and I'm specifying a password here. And that makes sure they are meeting those parameters down there. Important thing to understand. Just consider it the way, for example, you were installing an on-prem SQL server, an on-premises SQL server, and during installation, it was asking you for the authentication. It could be a Windows authentication, or it could be a mixed mode authentication. So underneath your mixed mode, you used to specify SA, the system administrator, in the password. It's the same details we are specifying in here, okay? I can have multiple options like my networks, access this tier. If I would like to bound it to my Azure hosted firewall, you can have some additional settings associated in there. That's fine. You can enable advanced data security at an additional cost, but that's okay. Once you are done with these configurations, let me click on review and create. That will do some validations. Important thing to notice, which I would be emphasizing much more in this particular webinar, is the costing associated with your cloud resources. So here, if you take a look, there is no additional charges. The estimated cost per month is nothing. This is one of the biggest difference I would be talking about today. So let me submit this deployment. I'm clicking on create and I am submitting this deployment to my Azure deployment under the research group on the deployments area. And once that gets completed, we would be having a functional SQL server. We need to understand a basic difference here, and I hope every one of you knows that a database server is completely different from a database. Ideally, a database server would be the collection of databases, and the database are the actual term where my tables, views, stored procedures, functions, and all those values would be in there. So currently, I haven't created any database over there. So in the meanwhile, it is currently deploying. Let me take you to my PowerPoint presentation, the demonstration screen, where I've just done the very first exercise. And the important thing is I've created a SQL database server using Portal. Okay, and there can be multiple options. How can I do that? One, it could be a platform as a service component. Two, it could be infrastructure as a service component. So currently I've selected the platform as a service. How do we know that? Because we didn't had any operating system. We didn't install the licensing on top of that. We didn't started the setup of SQL Server on-prem, following everything all together. So let's consider it. You got a SQL Server on-prem installed on top of a Windows Server domain joined machine, and now your organization wants to migrate it to the cloud. So you've got two options to choose from. One, either migrate that as a SQL Azure platform as a solution, then you have to do that migration steps, make sure you're complying the data migration tools and techniques down there. Second, for due to some reason costing availability or 100% control or manageability, so the organization decides no, instead of migrating only the database components, we would like to migrate our entire database server as it is. So we are talking about your virtual machine migration from on-prem to SQL Azure. Then you're technically migrating the whole VM, which is an infrastructure as a service component. As a fresh customer who is directly starting on Azure Cloud, you can either go for platform as a service compute, which I just did. If I show you that, let me click in here, and now you got a SQL server. So if I take you into the SQL servers area, I've got one SQL Server platform as a service component installed, which is 100% managed by Microsoft Azure. Okay. what the second concept I was talking about. So if you talk about a secondary option, there was an option called SQL Server Virtual Machine. So if anybody is considering a SQL virtual machine, in this case, it is true that it would be a SQL server on Azure, but that is inside a virtual machine, which is completely managed by you. So when you talk about how can you deploy SQL Server on Azure, two different ways: platform as a service and infrastructure as a service. Today's webinar is more focused on platform as a service compute in there. Okay, some of the basic differences in case of this virtual machine, you get the 100% ownership, and the virtual machine would incur the cost based on the compute and storage allocated to them. In case of a platform as a service, which I just deployed in there, I do not have any monthly running cost, zero cost for deploying a SQL Azure database server. I'm not talking about databases yet. Okay, let's start with the next example in here, which talks about creating a SQL Azure database, which could either be blank or which could either be a sample database. So let's start working with that, and we will talk about a couple of more differences down there. So let me take you to my virtual machines, the virtual demonstration environment here. And now I would be creating a new database underneath that. I can open my database server and I can directly create the databases right from there. Or if you want, I can search in for SQL database component here and I can get them created from here as well. So let's take a look both the ways. If I'm in here, what kind of database I would like to add to this database server? Is it a normal OLTP database or is it a data warehousing database? Previously known as the SQL data warehouse, that's been renamed to Microsoft Synapse Analytics. So it could be my OLAP databases as well. So let's start working with creating a blank database from here. I'm creating a SQL database hosted on SQL Azure platform as a service component. Important thing, when I click it inside that, couple of things are by default. It automatically picks up the subscription and the resource group in which your database server was deployed. So it automatically picks up the database server as well. The next thing is you need to enter the database name. Well, that could be anything, has to be unique inside this server, whatever you want to make it. So let's call it, it's going to be GTLDB01. Ideally should be a meaningful name. I'm just using this for the demonstration purposes. Okay. Do you want to use a SQL Elastic Pool? This is the thing we are just going to discuss in the next demonstration today. So as of now, I'm going to keep it no, because we don't know yet what is an elastic pool, why we should be using and all that. The next in the segment is the component or the configuration parameter, which will decide what is going to be our estimated cost per month. So let's click on configure this database. So currently it is generation 5, 2 virtual cores, 32 gig of storage. At present, if I create it, it's going to cost me something, but you would like to see what that compute and storage is. It is allocating that compute and storage to this particular database. So let me click on configure database, and it will open the next blade down there, which will talk about the database operations we can perform along with selecting the compute and storage component of that. So let's understand that, whether it is a general purpose, whether it is a hyperscale, whether it is a business critical. So if I move on the hyperscale category, I can pretty much define up to 80 virtual cores, 408 gig of memory. If you go on business critical app with things where you would like to consider n number of cores and the automated auto scaling functionalities and all, so that is giving you the compute and the storage associated with that. So let's say I would like to go on the provision or the serverless depending on whatever we choose, and you specify that I'm looking for 4 virtual cores down there, and then it is going to tell you what is going to be the estimated cost on your subscription if you're running it 24/7. Increasing and decreasing these values will definitely impact what is going to be the things. So let's say my data size is either going to be 8 gig in here, and accordingly I'll see my data pricings down there. So let me go down and I'm clicking on apply. So you can pretty much configure all these values, and I'm clicking on review and create. The moment I'm doing it, it is giving me the estimated cost on my currency set it up for the subscription. This is what is going to cost me 24/7. A rough estimate comes up in here. And this is not for the database server once again, guys. This is only for this individual database. Okay, let me click on create. And I'm actually submitting this deployment to create a database on my SQL Azure hosted database server, which is a platform as a service component. In the meanwhile, the deployment is working. Let me show you a couple of things. If you go to your Microsoft Azure, let me go to my resource groups in here. There is a resource group which I created today with the name called Azure Weekends-SQL Azure. If you click over here, that is going to show you what ideally all the resources does it contains. And then I can go to my deployments area, which is going to tell me what were the previous deployments, what is my current deployments, the ideal durations. If you want to see a couple of more things related to them, you click on the deployment at any point of time. That's going to tell you what it did, all these deployment details, what were the input parameters we specified in there, are we expecting any output parameter with that, and if you would like to get an Azure ARM template out of it, you can pretty much have the ARM template downloaded from there, which is giving you all the ARM based queries and all these values, which we can always download this JSON file. Well, that's fine. That's one thing which we can always do. Currently, I've submitted a deployment and the deployment gets succeeded. If you click over here, one of the database got created. So if you come up over here, this is my database 01, which is on this particular platform as a service hosted SQL server. And I can see some of the matrices connecting the query editor. We will be doing it in a bit over here. Let me do the secondary way. If I come up over here and I would like to deploy and provision a SQL database right from there. So let me click on my SQL database. When I click on add, this time it is not automatically populating the subscription resource group and all. You can always choose it whatever you want. So for example, if it's this one and you want to move to a different one, you can always do that. So you can always change these things, versus if you're creating it from the server, the values are fixed down there. Okay. So let's say this one is going to be my GTLDB02. That is my second database, would be hosted on the same server I provisioned earlier. Okay. Still, I'm not using Elastic Pool. I'm going with 2 cores, 32 gig of storage, but this time on my advanced settings, I would like to make it a backup data, and that would be from my AdventureWorks, or making a backup database, or you want to making up a sample database where some of the AdventureWorks sample data would be included in there in form of tables, views, and multiple things. Let's include the sample data. Coming back in here, clicking on review and create. And then I'll be clicking on the create button, which will technically submit this deployment for creating a secondary database right across in there. The only thing why I've shown you that it could be a blank database, which is going to be by default. It could be a sample database as well. It could be a backup database as well, depending on the parameters you change on your SQL Azure provisioning blade. All right. Now it is certainly deploying those values in there. Let's understand in the meanwhile what exactly our SQL Elastic Pools are. So when you talk about a SQL Elastic Pool, consider that as a logical container which can have multiple databases underneath them. So when I talk about how does that happen, so this logical container will have a compute and storage associated with that. And that compute and storage will be shared among these databases. So what we have done so far, we created 2 databases, and we understand that when we were creating every one of them, it was asking us to select compute and storage. So ideally, two databases are costing me separately, and in this case the amount is huge. It's somewhere around 300 bucks down there, $300, which is 15,000 INRs, kind of that, and that is what it will cost me every month per single database with the compute. What if I don't require that much dedicated compute as of now? I'm looking to connect some of my web applications or some of my APIs down there that won't be that much highly effective or in terms of highly demanding applications. So in that case, I'm looking for a cost efficient option. So if you take a look currently, if I go to my databases, let me go on my SQL databases node down there, and then I should be seeing two of them. Sometimes if you don't see that, I usually do a control plus F5 and that will appear right across in there because of the cache or something. So I've got two databases, and both of the databases are having their dedicated compute, so they are costing me individually. I'm looking for a cost effective solution here. So let me go ahead, and this time I'm actually looking for Elastic Pool. So when I click on SQL Elastic Pools, this is the area from where I can create that shared container. So let me create an Elastic Pool here. Let me just do that. When I'm doing it, I'm selecting my subscription along with my resource group I'll be using today, and let me call it as my GTL Pool 01. So whatever you would like to name it, it should be a meaningful name. Could be for geographical locations, could be for the business functions, could be for the hybrid situations, or maybe the name of the department or a dev test production. So dependingly, you should be having an efficient, meaningful name in here. On which server I would be deploying this Elastic Pool, that's the server which I created at the very first demonstration. And now I'm selecting my compute and storage. So let's say when I click on configure compute and storage, I'm actually looking for 6 virtual cores, and I'm looking for 100 gig of storage in here. So depending on your application demands and all, we can specify all these values. The estimated cost is coming up over here per month if you're running it 24/7. Let me click on apply, and then I will be clicking that. Let me click on review and create, and now you can see that there is an estimated pricing. So before I hit create, or let me hit create in here, and let me discuss that point now. We created 3 different type of Azure services. 1, a database server. 2, a SQL database, whether it's blank or sample, that's a different thing. 3rd, an Elastic Pool. Out of these 3 services, the very first one, which was a database server, was not having any pricing associated with that, because it is just a logical referencing instance managed by Microsoft. It is the actual databases or the Elastic Pools which will cost you the money. So the SQL servers doesn't cost us anything. It is the actual databases or the Elastic Pools. Why I'm pinpointing that? Because of when the misconception in case of your on-prem, if a project manager kicks in and say, hey, let's get a database server ready, and we are talking about our on-prem data center. In those situations, we provision a virtual machine, we assign the virtual CPUs, we assign the RAM, but that is not to the databases. We assign it to the complete database server itself. So in the on-prem scenarios, usually the costing is considered for the SQL servers, not the databases. In cloud, it is actually for the databases, and that's good because I don't know how many servers we require, how many databases we require. So depending on what you will actually use, so what you use is what you pay when it comes to the cloud model down there. So that was one thing we discussed about the Elastic Pool. We created that shared container in here. Now let's see what I'm doing next. So this time, if I'm creating on SQL database, let me hit my SQL database creation wizard. I've got 2 databases here. I'm clicking on add another one, and I would like to call it my GTL DB03, a 3rd database. Sorry, let me make it 03. And this time, Instead of compute and storage, I'm selecting the elastic pool to yes. So I would like to use an elastic pool now, and it will tell me all the elastic pools I have in the server. One of them which I recently created, I just selected that. And when you click on, or let's say it is also going to be a sample database included in here with the collision settings and all that, case insensitive AS. Let me click on review and create. And now you will see that the cost is included in the pool. So more often, there are some questions in your Azure related examinations as well, that in which scenarios cost is going to be the concern. Does a database server incur a cost in SQL Azure scenarios or on Azure cloud? Depends. If it is a platform as a service SQL server we are talking about, zero cost. If it is a SQL Server virtual machine, well, that's a regular infrastructure as a service costing down there. Does a SQL database incur the cost? The answer is yes, always. But would it be dedicated or would it be shared? Depends. If my database is in the pool, it will be the shared costing. If my database is using a dedicated compute and storage, that will be a dedicated costing. So these are the two things. You used to call a single database with the dedicated compute and storage, and then you talk about the elastic pool with the shared pricing over there. Good thing, it is great for cost effectiveness and depending on your application. So let me submit this deployment here as well. And that will pretty much submit and create this database on my SQL Azure platform. Now in our regular scenarios, being into the project team, the solution architects, the technical architects will mutually design or discuss that what should be the database deployment strategy. If I'm talking about a high consuming, high IOPS stress scenario down there where performance is the utmost priority, I would rather go with the dedicated compute and storage option. Whereas if cost is my primary concern, there are some budget constraints or something, we can introduce the SQL Elastic pools with the shared costing pattern down there. So I created 3 different databases altogether. So if you go on the SQL databases now, let me do a control plus F5, a refresh from server. So I should be seeing all those. They'll appear right across, doesn't matter. Or let me go to my SQL servers down here. I got a SQL server down there. And now if you take a look, if you scroll it down, I've got one pool and I've got 3 databases. This is the pool and these are the 3 databases. The 1 and 2 are with the dedicated compute. The database number 3 is inside my Elastic pool. So you can see the Elastic general purpose is being associated with that. Okay, what is my next ideal step? Let's test them up. If I click on my DB02, for example, and I would like to query something, all of us might be familiar, we used to have SQL Server Management Studio where we can query these databases and start working on any kind of CRUD operations or pretty much DDL or DML statements execution down there. How does it work with SQL Azure? Well, pretty much the same way, plus some exceptions. So let's understand them. How do we do that? Let's do it on the cloud first. So I'm talking about my query editor. The one which I'm going to show you will give me an error. I will tell you the reason of the error and the resolution of the error as well. So let me click over here and that will tell you how much secure these SQL Azure databases are. I'm trying to log in with my user ID password, which we supplied previously. Important thing, these are absolutely correct, but I will not be able to log in even when I'm on the Azure portal, which is Microsoft hosted itself. So when I click OK, it will tell me I'm not supposed to log in with that IP address unless I add it into my firewall rules. So you see that it's telling me cannot open server requested by the login because this public IP address from where I'm currently connected using my VPN is not included into the server's firewall. So how do we do that? Let me take you somewhere first. I click on my database down there. There is an option called Set Server Firewall. Let me click over here. That will ideally say I've got multiple client IPs in here. I can add the one which is available, or I can make it like this one as well. My IP address. This is the one which I want to allow in here. This is going to be my start IP and the end IP address. I can pretty much add it like this, or I can click on add client IP and let me save it. So that means the IP address or the range which I've just included in here, those IPs would be into the allowed list to access that server, even on the Azure platform. That's how secure by default these things are. So let me click on my database real quick. I'm moving to my query editor now, and let me go with the user ID password creation. So let me enter the authentication mechanism. And then since they are the SA level access, so it is telling me logging in, and boom, there we are. So that is one way of accessing them. You see, it was with the sample data. So it is having all those sample tables and everything included in here. Let's say if I'm writing select asterisk from saleslt.customer and I would like to execute this particular statement, I can always do it from here, and that'll give me all the data required for that. What if someone's looking for creating a table that's going to be my GTL visitors, for example, and what I would like to make some changes, that's going to be my visitor ID. Let me call it identity, my seed value and the step value. I also want to make it a primary key. That's fine. Let's call it a visitor name. Just for demonstration, I'm showing you what could be these values altogether. So let me just have, and let's get them created in there. So that's my query down there. Let me execute this, and the query will get executed successfully, and my table got created. So it is a query editor, which is an in preview feature as of now. Okay, that's cool. That's one way of accessing them. What about the next? So let's go in here and let me try connecting to my education cluster database. And I will be going in with one of my virtual machine listed in here. Let me log in real quick. So let me just go in there. Important thing to notice, when I'm on these virtual machine, which is hosted on the data center itself, it is a on-prem hosted virtual machine accessible over the internet. What I'm doing next here, I'm searching for SQL Server Management Studio. So let me go in there. I'm talking about my SQL Server Management Studio, and let me run that as administrator. So let me go in here. And it's important the way we are connecting to that. So this is just a tool which I'm actually using to connect to my database servers down there. And I'll show you multiple differences now. So we discussed creating a platform as a service SQL server on the cloud. So this is something else. I'll come back to this screen later on. At present, I would like to go with this on-prem server with Windows authentication. Let me click on connect. So I'm connecting to the SQL server, which is hosted on-prem. It's a regular server down there. You can see plenty of databases in here. The security objects are in there, server objects, application, SQL Server agent, all those things what usually would be there in an on-prem SQL server down there. What if I would like to connect to my SQL Azure database server? So that is going to be the way how we will be connecting them. So for that, if I take you to my SQL server, for example, or any of the databases down there, let me click down there. And there I have my SQL server connected. On top of it, let me go to any of my database settings. So I would like to go with database number 2, and which is having the sample data which we created down there. Underneath this database, there is an option called Show Database Connection Strings. And this is your best friend if you're developing your application connecting to SQL Azure, because when you click, either it's your regular radio.net or Java database connectivity or Open Database connectivity, PHP or Go, you get that connection string which you would need to use. So it's like any regular thing: initial catalog, the data source, the user ID, password, persist security info, all true. What we need to take a look, so you got the GTL DBSVR, that's the name of my database server, .database.windows.net is the suffix, port number 1433 is what is the default port for the SQL server, unless you want to change it on your network security group. So let me go in here. That was my GTL DB SVR 97 database.windows.net, and I'm talking about 1433. Let me use my credentials down there with the password. Important thing to notice, make sure 1433 port numbers are allowed on the firewall and you are on the active internet connection. When you're trying to do that, now you see that it is saying that, well, that is good, but there is an IP address which has to be added to your Microsoft Azure firewall rules because this is a different IP from where I'm trying to access that. So how do we do that? I can manually add it just the way we did on the firewall rules, or if you're on SQL Server Management Studio 2014 or a later edition, you can directly sign in over here and you can add it directly from this account. So let me quickly log in. This is the account I would like to use. Let me key in my password over here. I'm sorry, that's a different password I need to enter. My apologies. All right. And this is the one I should be having. There we go. And because I've got my multi-factor authentication enabled, so I need to enter my MFA code, which I'll be receiving. Let me just have it over here. All right. And let me click on verify. So that is technically logging me into my Azure, and I can directly add that firewall right from my Visual Studio or right from my SQL Server. Instead of, another way of doing it is I can do it from the Azure portal itself. All right, that's fine. Let me just have it one more time. And let me verify. Make sure I go into the authentication process. All right, and now I'm logged in. I can directly add this IP right from there. And when I do so, we will cross-verify that later on that it's added to the firewall. And now it is connecting us to our SQL Azure hosting database on our SQL Server Management Studio. You can see that I've got all the databases listed in here, whether it's database 1 or database 2 or database 3, whether it is SQL Elastic Pool or a dedicated database. I've got all these tables listed up in here. Someone asked me, hey, that's great. Can we create new databases right from here, which will get created directly into the server? Hell yeah, we can always do that. So let me go on a new query window here. That's okay. And out of cache, that's not a problem. We can always configure that. We need to restart other Visual Studio and SQL Server. That's fine, but that's one way how we connect our SQL Azure hosted database right across in our Management Studio, and we can start working with all those operations, whatever may come up in here. So there was one quick thing when we talk about our database deployment. What if I go on my DB02 and now I would like to see my set server firewall? So you will see one of the other IP address which got added, and we did it directly from the SQL Server by logging in, by signing in right across in there. So there was a couple of things. We can do plenty of more things in here. For example, I can involve security. So when I go to my SQL Server, let me open the SQL Server here. And then depending on whatever operations you might want to perform, I've got all these options open up in here. You want to add them to a failover group, so you can always do that. Managing their backups, always welcome. AD integrations, you can always do that. So we've got all these options available in here. I've got my database migration tool as well, which can help me migrating my on-prem databases to the cloud down there. If you're on any database down there, you want to perform some database related matrices, you can see them from this monitoring workspace. You want to integrate your Power Platform within your database, whether it's for analytics and reporting using Power BI, or whether it's your Canvas app or model driven app or portal apps using Power Apps, or whether it's your automated workflow processing service using Power Automate. We can integrate our Power Platform right in there. You can configure the Azure applications if you want to do that and enable the high availability of your database right across. You can pretty much configure the pricing in terms of upgrade, making it to the next plan, or downgrading it with fewer resources. So you've got full control as far as these things are concerned. In terms of manageability, in terms of automated backups, in terms of managing the backend infrastructure, that is a shared responsibility, and Microsoft pretty much manages that particular thing out there. So there was one quick thing what we had as part of these demonstrations talking about SQL Azure deployment scenarios. I'm sure there could be n number of major things which we can discuss, but this is what we planned for a 45-minute session down here. Now feel free to have the questions. I'll open the chat room in there. In the meanwhile, you can always visit us on GTechLearn.com, and there would be an event section where you would see the upcoming events for Microsoft Azure, Dynamics 365, Business Central, Finance and Operations on multiple scenarios down there. You can always register them in the no-cost events associated in here. So that was what we had for this particular webinar. We can always have the question and answers now. Let me quickly open the chat window for everyone. So let's go ahead with your questions, guys. Let's see a couple of questions we can answer during the time frame. Your questions on the chat. Okay, there is a question from Mansari44. Can we import our local SQL Server database into Azure SQL Server? Will there be any challenges while doing it? Are you trying to doing it with a database copy tool or a database move tool? You may have some challenges coming up. Instead of that, you should be looking up for your database migration tool, which is a free of cost tool available from Microsoft. Download it, install it. It will ask you your permissions and assess your database scenarios, and will give you a report even before migration that your database is 98% fit or 100% compatible, and you can pretty much migrate it using the database migration tool service directly from Microsoft Azure. Free of cost, no other things down there. Another question from Perveen Kathuri. How do you change the SQL port number instead of the default port? Well, always you can proceed with your database things in there. So if I show you my portal interface on my database, I've got my connection strings. So at any point of time, you can enable your data securities and you can enable the networkings down there. So if I go on my SQL server here, the one which we deployed, you further move it down across in there, and you can start working with the connection strings. You can start working with the private endpoints. You can start working with the virtual networks, and that would be the area which will help you changing up, adding virtual networks, changing up, creating a custom port support right in here. Instead of 1433, you want to use something else down there. I've got another question from Naveen Kumar, that how can I add IP addresses every time I log in from MS SQL Server after a system restart? Okay. So to talk about it, guys, usually that's not your private DHCP address we are talking about. It is a public IP address. So most of your corporate line connections, lease line connections is going to stay the same. Just in case if it's different, you need to add it or make a PowerShell script which will do it for you, number one. Number two, does it mean if I have a database deployed and it is connecting to a web application which is being accessed by 10,000 different users, do I need to add those 10,000 IP addresses over here? Well, no, not at all. It is only for the database level operations, who's creating, connecting to the backend and all that. Ideally, the developers, the test team, who would be having their public IPs, and they need to list on the set for server firewall. It could be at the SQL Server firewall level. It could be at the database firewall level as well. If you would like to integrate, another question from Sharon Sharma, how can we add on prem domain user in a SQL Server with a SA access? Well, for that, it's a whole different concept altogether. You need to work on Azure Active Directory, and the Azure Active Directory is having a component called Azure AD Connect. Download it on your on-prem instance, configure it. That will enable the synchronization between your on-prem AD to your Azure Active Directory, and thereafter enable your Azure AD authentication to your database server, and you'll be able to add that. Another question coming up if I want to deploy SQL jobs in platform as a service, is it possible to create? We're talking about SQL Server agents, we're talking about jobs running in the background. So that's where the Azure batch service kicks in. Using Azure batch services, you can create your batch jobs, add them into the pool, specify the schedule and the recurrences, and that'll do exactly what you want to do over there. If you want to create jobs like the integration services for connecting third-party services down there, you've got Azure Logic Apps, which is having 300 plus different connectors, can help you achieve those scenarios down there. Okay, is Azure available for developer practices and all? So if it is related to how do you access the Azure portal, you can always activate a free trial which will give you 12 months access for 60 plus services and a $200 free credit for the first 30 days. And after that, you only pay as you go solution. So you can always try it for free for a month. And after that, you go for the pay as you go subscription, unless your organization does have some Azure promotional subscriptions and you can pretty much work underneath them. All right, let's have some more questions if they're coming up. Right, got one. I've got an ad, and before we sign off again, guys, a couple of misconceptions which we always do. So we deployed a SQL Azure database server today, which is containing plenty of databases down there. Now, important thing is it could be a platform as a service component, which we just did. It could be a SQL VM as well. Or a SQL managed instance as well. The difference between them is platform as a service, all the patches, hotfixes, updates, automated backups are completely managed by Microsoft. In case of a managed instance, then you're gonna be managing that, or your vendor's gonna be managing that, or if you're deploying a SQL Server virtual machine, your VM administrator is going to manage that and making sure it's up to the mark, including the databases, the patches, all of your things down there. So a SQL VM deployment is just as you're migrating your on-prem SQL Server to Azure with 100% control over there. Another thing, in case of this one, the cost is ideally divided on the VM, the compute and storage, what you allocate. In platform as a service, for a server, there is a zero cost associated down there. The actual cost will be by the databases, whether they are the individual performance compute databases or whether they are deployed into the elastic pool. All right, perfect. So this is what we had for today's session, guys. I hope you enjoyed this introductory session when we talk about SQL Azure databases on Azure. That was our timeline for today. Thank you for joining me today. I should see you in the upcoming sessions down there. Keep following us on the social media channels, and the recording of this session will be available quite soon over your email addresses. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the day and the evening. Bye-bye.